As you know, it's inaugural lecture, and I'm fascinated by this idea of the scientific method, about research, about challenging things, about being prepared to admit errors, but in the end going on the latest consensus. Dame Anne was Professor of Molecular Biology and Cell Biology at the University of Aberdeen before she was named Vice Principal for External Affairs and Dean for Europe. She then served as the first ever Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland from 2006 to 2011, and crucially was the first ever Chief Scientific Advisor for the whole of the European Commission from 2012 to 2014, and where she was described as one of the most influential scientists in Europe. And she is a strong defender of evidence-based policies, particularly in relation to GM crops, which, as we know, has always been a very controversial issue. So I'm looking forward to what she has to say. She'll speak for about an hour, and then I will kind of field some questions, and we'll have about half an hour for that.
Samira, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. For me, it's quite a special thing to give the inaugural Rosalind Franklin Lecture, because as a scientist, and I guess as a female scientist, Rosalind Franklin is always someone who I've paid attention to, and I was very sort of shaken by the sort of environment that she had to live in to do some of the research that she wanted to do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the context of the talk. But the title, as you can see, is Why Evidence Really Matters. And I suppose I've spent the last 10 years looking at how you might use evidence for policy making. So rather than looking at policy for science, I've been looking at science for policy. That's the way around. So trying to translate all the knowledge that we generate to have real impact when it comes to making robust, defensible, effective, efficient policies, which then we all benefit from. Now, when I was, and for those of you who are not scientists, don't worry. I'm not going to talk all about science all of the time, so I hope that everybody will feel included in what I want to say. In thinking about this talk a couple of weeks ago, I was reading a book at the time, and this is the book that I was reading. And it's called The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And in the first sentence of the book, or the first couple of sentences by William Kamkwamba, the book is by who's based in Malawi. He said, "Before I discovered science, magic ruled the world." And as a scientist, that, of course, attracted me. And he's a very impressive young man who, with very little education, absorbed information from books and decided that he could build a machine to harness the wind and provide power for the community in which he lived. And that was transformative because people could study at night. They could do things with power, which was really important for his community. And then thinking also about, well, it's a talk that will involve science, but talk that is proposed by the British Humanist Association. So I was thinking, what does it mean to be human? And as a scientist, I came up with this definition, which is a pictorial definition. For me, this defines what it is to be human. This is the Atlas detector at the Large Hadron Collider. Now, you might think, okay, she's lost it. But this makes me proud to be human, in all honesty, looking at the Large Hadron Collider. And why? Because 120 nationalities collaborate together. There are 2,500 employees at CERN, understand it. But recreating the machinery, the ability to imagine, to construct, to collaborate, to work with people, to overcome problems, and to come out with the most beautiful result, delivering a Higgs particle which helps us understand what gives this mass, is a wonderful thing. And they're still at it, looking at parallel universes and other unexplored massive particles. So for me, that defines what it is to be human, and I think it's quite a special thing. But as a scientist, you can do your research and you can deliver a lot of knowledge from that research. But as my own PhD supervisor, a lovely man called David Eller, told me quite early on, research not communicated is research not done. And I never forgot that. And I realized the importance of communication, because when I was at school, so I went to school in Scotland, and there we have a very broad educational system, so you don't narrow down into specialisms. When you leave school, you still have at least 6 subjects which you are kind of keeping up in the air. So a very broad spectrum, which meant that I was, of course, interested in science, but I was also interested in art, poetry, literature, sculpture, music, all of these things. And I could speak about them. And then I went to university, Edinburgh University, to study biochemistry. And at the end of my study at biochemistry, I came out of university and I was pretty knowledgeable about biochemistry, but all I could speak was biochemistry. I had lost the ability to communicate. And communication is really important, because if we don't do that, we have a problem. And I was trying to think of an example. So I really liked this film, 2003, Lost in Communication. And why I like it so much, if we look at this, you know, there was a lot going on there between them. If you haven't seen the film, I would recommend it. But were they really communicating? So you lose a lot in translation if you don't think about how to communicate. And it also reminded me of a personal experience. So here's another. So instead of Scarlett Johansson and Bill Murray, this is the previous president of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, and me. This is only 3 years ago, but actually we're both looking a lot younger there than we are now. So it was quite stressful for both of us, I think. But what I realized is that if you lose things in translation, if you're talking about something, then it is an enormous problem. So you have to continually be mindful of communication, and I will include that as we go through this talk. I'm going to talk roughly about these things, not necessarily in this order, but just to give you an idea, I want to talk about the use and misuse of evidence. What is evidence? How do we use it? How can we distort evidence? What's credible evidence compared to not credible evidence? So these are the sorts of things I'm going to talk to you about. So first of all, what do I mean by evidence? And you can talk about scientific evidence, economic evidence, social evidence. I'm focusing mainly, I guess, on scientific evidence. But really, evidence is an available body of facts which you use to test whether something is true or not. That's a very loose description of what you might consider to be evidence. So, given that that's evidence, is it a constant thing? Well, of course it's not constant, and that's one of the things that's interesting for a scientist, that evidence continually evolves as more knowledge becomes available. So a good example of this might be, and I'm thinking now of Rosalind Franklin, who was born in 1920. She died in 1958, just 2 years after I was born, so we overlapped, but just a little bit. But if I look at what we used to think, so evidence used to be that, and these were the adverts that we saw, more doctors smoke Camel cigarettes than any other cigarette because it keeps your airways clean. So that's what we thought in the 1950s. This is what we know now. This is a healthy lung, and this is a tobacco smoker's lung. So that we know that evidence changes. And Samira said this in the introduction. We have to be mindful, particularly as scientists, that evidence does change, not as rapidly as governments and their philosophy, but it does change. And we need to be alert to that, and we need to be constantly updating how we talk about evidence. Now, because we're in the 1950s here, this evidence was a welcome change. I just thought, because you know that Rosalind Franklin had quite a challenge to get her scientific ideas accepted and talked about. And She really wasn't part of the camaraderie or the clique of scientists when she worked here in London. I just thought I would remind you of what the social environment was in the 1950s for women. Okay, so here is, that this is true. It's from Housekeeping Monthly, 1955. And this is a good wife's guide. So for any women in the audience there wanting to know how to be a good wife, have dinner ready. Put a ribbon in your hair, clear away the clutter, and prepare the children. Not for dinner, I guess, but listen to him. His topics of conversation are more important than yours. Don't complain if he's late or stays out all night. It's true. And remember, he's the master of the house. You have no right to question him. A good wife always knows her place. Men in the audience, dream on. But although we laugh at this now and it seems utterly ridiculous, this was a good wife's guide. And that was the time that Rosalind Franklin was working in. So when we look at what she did amazing things, and she was really pushing up against it. And I think particularly scientists like me have a lot to thank her for, because she was visible and she did do a lot for demonstrating that excellence that matters, not really your gender. Okay, so actually it's okay. When we talk about evidence, I want to explain to you where evidence comes from. And living in Europe, we're very lucky because Europe's #1 in the world in science, engineering, and technology. It's not the UK, it's not Germany, it's not France. It's all together, European Union. #1 in the world in terms of impact of the science that we do. Now, that'll surprise many of you because I guess if I'd asked, many of you might have said, well, surely that's North America. And I would say North America is excellent also at science, and they're much better than we are at talking about how excellent they are. We're not good at that at all. And although in a way that's culturally charming in Europe that we are very modest and so on, I think it's to our detriment because sometimes our young people think to be good I have to go to North America, go elsewhere. Actually, Europe's the best place I think you could be to do science. And whether it's looking at marine science, nanotechnology, and the amazing machines you can make, transport, capturing energy, launching satellites, neuroscience, whatever it is, we have fantastic achievements. We've also got fantastic infrastructure, and this is something that no member state in the European Union can deliver on. It's something that we can do collaboratively, and we do it very well. This is the European Southern Observatory's very large telescope. So although we're very good at building fantastic equipment to look at the universe, we're not awfully imaginative when it comes to naming it. So this is here on the Atacama Desert, the very large telescope. They're building another one 20 kilometers away. It's even bigger. It's called the Extremely Large Telescope, also true. So we've got great infrastructure. And what do we use it for? We use it to look at the very big. We look at our universe, how it was formed, how our planet came to be, what else is out there, all of the big, amazing questions that we like to ask. So the very big through ecosystems, how things work on our planet, how they interact, how they survive, how things become extinct and so on, how they evolve. This is more my scientific area. It's a bit reductionist where you take cells and you break them open and see what's happening inside. But when you do that, and one of the research areas I look at is how we all respond to stress, but at the molecular level. And by stress, I mean maybe if I was getting chemotherapy, that would be stressful for my cells. So how do the cells respond to that? So we can do that by looking at the individual molecules, and then we're back to CERN, where I started off, where we're looking at the fundamental particles in our universe. Now, all of this research allows us to tackle some of the biggest questions that we're facing. And these are massive challenges, these global challenges, whether we're looking at disease, whether we're looking, particularly in the developed world, looking at aging, looking at energy security, natural disasters such as flooding, and food security and availability of food supply and sustainability across our planet. The evidence that we generate helps us to tackle these problems. So it's incredibly worthwhile as long as we communicate it well and we make sure that when we generate the evidence, we get it to the people who can translate that evidence into something that makes a difference to allow us to address some of these challenges. It also allows us to translate our knowledge into creating devices for healthcare, for transport, for communication, for entertainment, whatever it might be, to enrich our lives, and also provides underpinning for the economy. So our research, our science, our engineering and technology is a fundamentally human pursuit that allows us all sorts of possibilities. And I suppose that from a scientist's point of view, I personally feel a very strong obligation to make sure that I do every day what I love, and I need to make sure, and actually you pay for it, I need to make sure you get the benefit of it. Now, it's part of our culture in Europe. So just thinking about this general European theme, science, engineering and technology are central to the culture that we have in Europe. Science invented the modern world, and Europe did that science that invented the modern world during the Enlightenment. Here's Rosalind Franklin. I put some modern day women, Athene Donald, physicist, Fabiola Gianotti, who is the new Director General of CERN, has just taken over. Marie Curie, you would know, Albert Einstein. The Nobel Prizes, European, we celebrate our science. And Svante Pääbo, I've just taken an abstract group of people. He looks at evolution. Okay, so we're good at science. We generate a lot of knowledge. What about the evidence that's generated? So what's credible evidence? Now, I wanted to give you two examples. Here's someone, Daniel Moynihan, who was from Ireland but went to the US and was a US senator, elected 4 times. And he said something that I like very much. And what he said is that we are all entitled to our own opinions, but not our own facts. And that's worth remembering when it comes to using evidence. And here's an example. This is, not many of you will know the Courier. It's a local paper from Scotland, near where I went to school. But they had as a front page this picture that I just took out, and it said 85% say Diana was murdered. So this is Mohammed Al-Fayed showing us the evidence. Showing us the evidence that 85% said. But actually, without wishing to insult you, it was 85% of you. And you might just have thought, yeah, I think she was probably murdered. So that's what that 85% meant. There was a big police investigation, and what the police said was there is no evidence to say that Princess Diana was murdered, along with Dodi Al-Fayed. Now, who do you believe? Okay, but what we need to do always is to test the evidence. So thinking about all having our own opinions, this for me is more an opinion. Facts are where we rigorously examine evidence and ask questions about it. There are lots of examples where we do use evidence well, and I'll give you one that I was involved in when I was Chief Scientific Advisor in Scotland. And this is last decade, but this is the Icelandic volcano, Eyjafjallajökull. I hope there's no Icelandic, thank you. Not sure it's quite perfect, but this volcano erupted, caused a huge plume. This was modeled by scientists actually at the European Commission at the Joint Research Centre. So here's Iceland, and we're looking at the red as the most dense dust or particles from this volcano. And you might see that it's coming over, I can't quite see where UK is, but if you can see it more clearly than me, it hit central Scotland first. So airspace had to be closed in central Scotland. And at that time, the First Minister was Alex Salmond, and he phoned me up and he said, politely, what on earth is going on? Because volcanoes erupt all the time, and we don't have to close airspace. So why on earth is this happening? So I'm a molecular biologist, not a volcanologist, so I didn't know, but other scientists are very collaborative, and within an hour, I had all the information I needed to be able to speak to our First Minister. And it was quite interesting because the dust that came out of this volcano has got a very high glassy content, a lot of silica in it. Now, why does that matter? Well, this thing here, this is a modern jet engine. And the interesting thing, and this won't make those of you who are anxious about flying very happy, but modern jet engines operate at a temperature above their melting temperature. And the reason they don't melt is because they have wonderful ventilation. It's like tiny capillaries that drag in air and cool the engine down. So it's very efficient, but it is operating above its melting temperature, which of course is reduced by the air being dragged through. But if you drag in glassy dust, the glass melts in the capillaries and it blocks them off. And the end result is that the cooling is not very efficient and the engine can melt. So I explained this to the First Minister, who then thought it was fine to close the airspace. Now that's translation of evidence. It's trying to make it meaningful. And also I'd have to say, science wasn't an unmitigated success here because if you look back, perhaps we were too precautionary in what was done, but all the time that this was happening and that dust was going into the atmosphere, flights went through the dust to collect atmospheric to find out where the dust was, how it was stratified, could we fly here or here instead of in the middle, to try and provide more evidence to reduce the risk but allow people to fly. And this is the Shroud of Turin here. And the assertion was that this was the shroud that was used to wrap Jesus when he was buried. And that you can clearly see it was, because there is the image, something recognizable to what you would see as portrayed as Jesus. So, and everything made sense. And so people were claiming that this is what it is. So 3 independent scientific groups, people with no vested interest in whether this was the Shroud of Turin or not. Well, it was the Shroud of Turin, but whether it was the actual garment used to, shroud used to wrap Jesus. And what they did was radiocarbon dating. They did it independently, and the result was that this is a medieval artifact. It's the 13th, 14th century, therefore we use the science to test the evidence and determine that it cannot be what was asserted. So this is how we move forward with science. This is how we use evidence. I said there were 3 independent groups with no vested interest, and that was important because what you would say is that then we could have some trust in what they did. And trust is something worth mentioning when it comes to science and evidence. So whose evidence do we trust? So doctors come out on top. So this is in the UK. So doctors, give yourself a pat on the back. Although look, you're going back 1%, not sure that's significant since 2014 to 2015, but almost 90% of people trust doctors. Teachers, very well trusted. Judges, also very well trusted. Here are the scientists. I'm pleased about this, but I was also disappointed when I went from being a standard scientist to a scientist working as a chief scientific advisor, that trust level drops significantly. So if you're a government scientist, you're not trusted as much. That's rather interesting for me. Hairdressers, though, they're coming in at 70%. So now, why is this important? And I don't know if you're going to see the next slide, but the next slide is very important for me. It's the same data. And so here we are with doctors at the top, scientists fourth, here are hairdressers. Ahead of the police, the man in the street, religious people, television newsreaders, civil servants, pollsters, lawyers. Down here, charity chief executives. So this would be like NGO chief execs, 47% trust. Yeah. Trade union officials, local councillors, builders, bankers, managers, journalists, 25%. Now keep this in mind because this is really important. Estate agents, well, government ministers, 22%, and politicians generally 21%, the least trusted people. Now, why for me this is deeply concerning is that in elections, I vote for these people to represent me. I really want to be able to trust them. So I am concerned, and I'm sort of concerned for our democracy, if we elect people, but we have no faith in them, no trust whatsoever in what they do. And so why don't we trust in them? And I would argue it's because they demonstrably don't use the evidence or are not transparent about the use of evidence. And they mix up evidence and philosophy. And I'll come back to this because for me, I think it's quite important. So where do the public, all the citizens in our population, where do they get their evidence from? Bearing in mind, generally here it's the scientists who generate the evidence, and they're reasonably well trusted. Is that where the public get their evidence from? No, it doesn't get its evidence from scientists by and large. So this is where society gets its evidence. So I'll come back to this, global warming's not happening because there's chaos. Suicides, that's because mobile phone masts. This one was stunning in a way. This was in December 2013 when Romania joined the European Union, which meant that there could be free movement of Romanians across the EU. And this was the headline, sold out, flights and buses full as Romanians head for the UK. Now, on 1st of January, the BBC managed to track down one Romanian at Heathrow who turned up on New Year's Day, one Romanian, and he had a job to go to. And over the next 10 days, there were 12 Romanians who came into the country. The data was not from the UK authorities because we don't collect that. That was from the Romanian embassy. So it might not have been completely accurate either. But this is where we get our evidence. This is opinion forming, and actually it's a concern. Now, I want to ask us to have a bit of a think about how we react to evidence and how we react to things like risk and probability. And I'm going to do a little experiment with you, if you'll allow me. I'll just show you the next slide. So risk and the perception of risk are two different things. So if we look at, you might have a perception about different forms of energy and how dangerous they are to generate the energy. Here's the data here, where if we look at the estimated deaths per terawatt hour, so just a measure of the energy generated, the number of deaths, you can see that the most dangerous form of energy is coal. But not one you see in the headlines much as being particularly dangerous. Next one is oil, gas, not so bad, hydroelectric power, not so bad either, nuclear power, not really detectable. So people's perception, though, if you ask people, is they say nuclear is the most dangerous. So we need to think about risk and perception of risk. And some things we don't appear to be very bothered about at all. So here's the amount of concern we have. So above this line, it's how concerned are we about these things. Cancer, not particularly concerned. Seems familiar to us, but yet many of us, 1 in 3 of us, will get cancer during our lifetime. most of that is treatable. So we don't all die of cancer. But it's a problem. Terrorism, on the other hand, which we obsess about all the time, so this is how concerned we are. This is the actual exposure to risk. It's very low. So let's think about risk. And I want you to do an experiment. So this may or may not work. That's the pleasure of experiments. So here's the question. In your working life, do you think you take more risk than the people you work with, or less risk? So in your working life, your job, do you take more risk than the people around you in your job, or do you take less risk? So please put up your hand if you think you take more risk than the people around about you. So if I do this, Who thinks they take less risk? Actually, you're a fascinating audience. So I've never ever had that result, which is interesting. If you go to North America, everybody thinks they're taking less risk than everybody else around them. And mostly, almost in every place in Europe, people think they're taking more risk than people next to them because of their way. We are quite risk averse generally in Europe. And we tend to think, I'm taking lots of risk, but they're not. Whereas in America, everybody thinks, I need to be taking more risk because everybody around me is taking more risk. So you've kind of bucked the trend. Don't know what that means. Something about humanists, I guess. But okay, so let's move on. The best way to combat gut feelings is to use evidence. Scientific evidence is sound, it's peer-reviewed. That's not perfect, but it's the best we have. And it evolves over time, but it doesn't change, for example, from one government to the next, which I think is important. Here's an example of not asking for evidence. Now, so I'm not trying to get at Russia, for example. This isn't anti-Russian propaganda, but in Russia, what happened was government decided in the 60s and moving on that what they would do is divert water that was flowing into the Aral Sea, which was the 4th largest lake in the world. And what they thought was they would divert the water coming into the lake and use it for irrigation. But they didn't ask for evidence. They didn't ask what the implications would be if they did that. And they assumed because it was such a big lake, it wouldn't really be a problem. So this was actually taken in 2000. You can probably see this is where the extent of the lake used to be, all the way around here. But in 2000, that was what was left. This is a real photograph of simply a stranded big ship because there is no water or very little water. This was in 2012, what was left in the Aral Sea. So it's one of the world's biggest environmental disasters. And it occurred because people did not ask for evidence before doing something which could have huge environmental impacts. So that's an example of what goes wrong if you don't use evidence. Now, you can get evidence, you can generate it, and it can be peer-reviewed, but it's possible to distort evidence. And I think most of us would be aware of confirmation bias. And let me just give you a very simple example of that if you've not come across it. Now, I guess in an audience like this, there will be some people who like David Cameron and they like his politics, and there'll be some people that like Jeremy Corbyn and like his politics. You know who you are. So let's imagine that you are someone that really likes David Cameron. And I come running in here and I say, you know, the most amazing thing happened. I just heard that David Cameron has been arrested because apparently he beat up an old lady, pulled her out of a taxi because he wanted to get into the taxi first, and he pulled her out, pushed her down in the street, got into the taxi and drove off. But he was caught and he's been arrested, so he'll be brought to justice. Now, those of you who like David Cameron will think, you must have got that wrong. That would be that can't be right. He is a really nice guy. This just can't be true. And if you switch it around the other way and it's Jeremy Corbyn and you like him, that's what you'll think. But if you don't like Jeremy Corbyn or you don't like David Cameron, you would say, do you know, I knew that would happen one of these days because, you know, he is a nasty piece of work. Now, every single one of us, including scientists who are just normal people, we all have confirmation bias. And it's an interesting thing because science is not without value and not without emotion. And that's something that scientists have to challenge themselves constantly with, because you have to be clear if you are, let's say, for example, you are somebody who believes in the evidence around climate change, then do you just look at the papers which are published confirming your view of climate change? And if you're a climate change denier, do you just look at those papers which come up with some evidence that suits your viewpoint? And it was mentioned in the introduction, and I want to mention to you just a little bit about consensus and the value of consensus, because it's a very powerful tool. And what does consensus mean? It does not mean unanimous agreement. Consensus is general agreement. That's what a consensus is. So I thought I'd put this up. I'm going to give you two examples of an interesting distortion of evidence, in my view. So this petition was started, I think, in the 90s, and it's been added to since in the US. And there's 31,500 American scientists have signed this petition, including 9,000 with PhDs. So not just a degree in science, but a higher degree in science as well. And here's an example, somebody who has got a PhD in physics saying that, urging the US government to ignore the Kyoto Agreement and any similar proposals, because what they're saying is limits on greenhouse gas emission would harm the environment and hinder advancement of science and technology and damage the health and welfare of mankind. So they're pretty motivated. They think climate change, man-made climate change, is not happening, and they're asking that we don't try and limit greenhouse gas emission at all. So what people say is that, well, so there isn't a consensus then on the scientific evidence. And actually, there is a consensus on the scientific evidence. So there is general agreement. There, of course, is some uncertainty. So what we don't know is how many parts per million CO2 will give rise to exactly how much average global temperature increase. And actually, it's worthwhile remembering, and if we think about physics and why this for me is so alarming, there are some fundamental laws in physics, and we benefit very much on our planet from the greenhouse effect. So if we didn't have the greenhouse effect, we'd all be sitting here really shivering. Life probably wouldn't have evolved the way it has on our planet, because that greenhouse effect keeps our surface temperature a good 10, 15, 20 degrees higher than otherwise would be on average around the planet. But we're adding to that greenhouse gas effect by our emissions of CO2. And if we look back as much as we can, at least back over 1 million years, where we can take measurements by looking at ice cores, and we look at the amount of particularly CO2, one greenhouse gas, that was present in the atmosphere, it has always varied between 180 parts per million and 280 parts per million. So 280 parts per million, a very warm period, 180, a glacial period. So there is a natural cycle between 180, 280. At the moment, as I'm speaking to you, it's over 400 parts per million. And the difference between 280 and 400 is us and our activity on the planet. What does it do, this CO2? Well, it's effectively like a fleece blanket. What we're doing is putting a fleece blanket around our planet. And it is a simple, fundamental law of physics. The planet then warms up. As the planet warms up, ice melts, sea level rises, and so on. It will have a significant impact on our planet. So this is a distortion of evidence, but let's take another example. Samira mentioned in the introduction about GM, and a group that I interacted a lot with when I was working in Brussels, they got very, very angry with me, I suppose, because I talked about the consensus that the technology of GM is safe. Now, I'm using the words, the technology is safe. There is a scientific consensus. You can't read these, I just put them on for effect. They're all to get you to realize these are not individuals. These are European Academy Science Advisory Council, all the European academies across Europe, all saying the technology is safe. However, this group called, I can't remember their full name, that they are campaigning against GM, and there are 313 signatories. And what they say is, well, then there isn't a consensus. But yes, there is, and actually this is misleading citizens to imply that there is not a consensus about the safety of this technology when there is. What we have to do as society, and this is not for scientists to do, we can tell you the technology is safe. You should decide when and where you want the technology used. That's significant, and that's worthy of debate, and that does include values. But when you drill back, we can't start arguing about the safety of the technology because we do have a scientific consensus. So, can scientists have a key role in ensuring that policies are based on evidence? And this reminded me of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Douglas Adams' great creation here of the Babel fish. And for those of you who are aficionados of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you can just take the Babel fish, it's a universal translator, you can pop it in your ear and you can understand everything. He also said in the book, and the aficionados will know this, that he said that by allowing everyone to understand each other, the Babel fish has caused more wars and destruction than anything else in the universe. So sometimes he's saying it's good not to know. But what I wonder is, are scientists effectively like the Babel fish? Can we be the translators of knowledge? Should we help because we generate the evidence and we also live in the real world? Can we start translating that for the benefit of policymakers, politicians, citizens, and others? So what would we do if we wanted to do this and make evidence matter? Is that we need to communicate what we do as scientists and why we do it. We need to demonstrate the relevance of what we do. So I started off with the Large Hadron Collider, and some of you might think, well, do you know, that was a fantastic thing. It was astonishing imagination and inspiration, and it was so ambitious. But, do you know, what practical value did it have? Our lives were changed out of all recognition by the Large Hadron Collider. The reason that we have the World Wide Web, nobody could have sat down with a piece of paper and invented that. It was invented in response to having to deal with all the data coming out of the Large Hadron Collider. If any of you have ever had a PET scan, positron emission tomography, using antimatter to be able to non-invasively scan the body, that came out of CERN. If any of you have eye problems and have to have eyes being scanned or artificial retinal implants put in there, came out of CERN. It goes on and on and on. So science always delivers, not always because we start out asking an applied question, but because knowledge just is useful and we end up using it. So it is relevant. We need to speak to the media. So it's great in the UK that we have something based here in London called the Science Media Centre, where the Science Media Centre links up expert scientists with the media to brief them, so that, because why should journalists are generalists, they have to know so much about everything. They can't always drill down into each scientific story. So the Science Media Centre acts as the marriage broker between journalists and the scientists. We need to speak to policymakers and politicians, although it is uncomfortable because we do speak different languages and we have different priorities. We need to speak to the general public. Scientists, I think, should be obliged. Not every scientist will be any good at it, but it's like my supervisor said, you know, research not communicated is research not done. We do have an obligation to talk about what we do, and actually it can also be very rewarding. We need to speak to NGOs who are sort of like unelected representatives of the public, and they are campaigning organizations. We need to talk to them about evidence. We just need to talk. We need to speak a language that everyone understands. And so here's the Stade de France rugby stadium. And if I tell you that lots of forest is being lost all the time, rainforest on the planet, and I tell you how many acres, you know, it doesn't really make any sense. But this is how much every 3 seconds. It's a lot. So you need to be able to communicate in a way that is relevant. And we also need to be honest about the facts we have and the ones we don't have, because that's the beauty of science. The beauty for me is that I don't know everything, and that's why it's so exciting. But sometimes people are pushed into this idea of having to say that we know everything. So you need to say when you're taking a shot in the dark, you really don't know, it's just you think it's a possibility, we need to do experiments, we need to test it, to really, I know. Now, why this is interesting is because I'm a scientist and I love uncertainty. It gets me out of bed in the morning. I love it. It's exciting. It's stimulating. I love not quite knowing. But if I work with politicians, they hate uncertainty. Now, there's the problem, is getting scientists, we love uncertainty, to work with politicians. I hate uncertainty, because they need to they need to say, this is the answer. And they don't want to have to come back in 2 weeks' time and say, you know, I was wrong about that, because in our current societal environment, that would not be acceptable. So there's a real problem then, is how you get those two people to work together. And it reminds me, and I think I'm right, that when Winston Churchill had a chief scientific advisor, and one of the things he said was, what I want most in the world is a one-handed chief scientific advisor. And the reason is because if you ask them a question, they always say, well, on the one hand, and that's true. I mean, I would hold my hand up to that, is that we as scientists need to understand the imperatives of politicians, and we need to translate our evidence better so that it can be used appropriately. We need to communicate uncertainty in a straightforward manner. We all know about weather forecasting. We understand there's some uncertainty, and I think that actually weather forecasting, which has become more and more accurate, but it is communicated quite well. I particularly like how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in their most recent reports, how they talk about uncertainty, because they talk about quite likely, very likely, extremely likely. So it's using language that we all understand, and they use that language to describe their scientific reports, which I think is very helpful. The other thing we have to do with evidence is that when we produce evidence, the policymaker or politician might still not know what do we do with that evidence. Sorry, I said this earlier, but we need to show empathy for public concerns. So if people don't like GMO, we need to accept that, and we need to take that on board. We need to see what the public are worried about. In terms of translating our evidence, it's not just giving the scientific evidence and saying, you need to cut emissions by this, that's it. Because that isn't helpful to a policymaker. So you probably need to start moving a little more towards them and say, To do that, you have a number of options. Here are some options. You could make the equipment we have more efficient. You could think about sustainable energy generation. Here we've got offshore wind. Or we could use nuclear energy. That's another form of sustainable generation. So here are three options. Might be a mix of the three. It might be one excluding one because we don't like one. But giving options, I think, is useful. What we also have to do, and actually I think it's for all of us, not just the scientists, but we need to raise our voices when we see evidence being misused. And here's an example, not from a scientific journal, but if you looked at this, in all honesty, if you saw this as a front page headline, global warming stopped 16 years ago, the Met Office report reveals. And here's the data, 1997, and here's the temperature going up and down, seasonal variation to 2012. It's the same. So it has stopped, hasn't it? They're showing us the data. Good for them. But that data, that's this data here. It's extracted from this. Now, is it legitimate to say that global warming has stopped? And the Met Office did not reveal this. This is, I guess, clever journalism. It's what editors do with headlines and so on. But it sounds like the Met Office have revealed this to us to say, by the way, it stopped. It isn't. It's Met Office data, or it's data that they have that has been used, in my mind, inappropriately in this context. Okay, so just concluding. I've talked a little bit about consensus. And consensus can do amazing things. So if you sometimes lose heart, and I have to say, although I am probably the world's biggest optimist, I have very dark moments about climate change. I just can't see us having the sophistication as a global community to be able to address this. There are too many vested interests. But trying to cheer myself up, I might look at this. So here's the hole in the ozone layer around the Antarctic. It was discovered actually very early on, but in the 1980s we had the Montreal Protocol, which proposed the ban in 1987, I think it was signed, to remove chlorofluorocarbons, which were the propellants that we used in aerosols at that time. It was implemented 2 years later to allow business which squealed and said, but then we can't have any aerosols and people want aerosol cans and things. But we are very imaginative people. We can solve any problem. And sure enough, we all now have aerosols, but they don't have chlorofluorocarbons in them. And we are sorting this environmental disaster. But just to remind you that when we identified the problem in the 60s and the 70s, it took a long time to come to this global consensus, and that hole in the ozone layer over particularly Antarctic will not be repaired until the end of this century. So 2100 is what we would hope that will be largely repaired by then. It takes a huge length of time to be able to recover from man-made disasters. But just think, though, it was a global consensus. So we can act together. We do have a precedent that we can work together. And I think in a way that should be heartening for us. The last thing I would say is that, and I mentioned this about GM technology. I think I made it very clear to you that there is a scientific consensus that the technology is safe. We use that technology in lots of different ways, to make drugs, pharmaceutical products that we use, to make all sorts of different products, sunscreens, numerous things, foods and so on. GM plants are a very sensitive issue with people. Now, this is where scientists need to step back, because as a scientist, it is not for me, and I would never promote or advocate GM crops. as a scientist. I would not do that because it is not my role. It's your role to decide whether you want GM crops. It's for me to tell you the technology is safe, and here might be how you would apply the technology. And it's for you to make the decision. But I'd have to say this year I was very disappointed because I currently live in Scotland, and last year in August, Scottish Government made an announcement to say that they would ban the growing of GM crops in Scotland because there were a lot of uncertainties around the technology, and there was economic evidence to identify that our products in Scotland would have an advantage if we didn't grow GM. Now, two things there. There is no evidence, the uncertainty around the technology. So that was not true. And they had not got economic evidence. So that was a hunch. It wasn't true. Now, I said we don't trust politicians. And what that does for me is that undermines my trust in politicians. Because what I want from them, because I've voted for them to represent me, and so what I want from them is I want them to show leadership. I want them to say, the evidence tells us the technology is safe. You, in this case, the Scottish citizens, you don't want this technology. I think that's probably true. Therefore, we will not approve the growing of GM in Scotland. Now, that leaves you in a very good place in my mind. It's paying attention to what citizens want, but it's also allowing citizens to say, that's interesting. What's in it for me if we did grow GM? And of course, in my mind, one thing that could be possible is to have, what would you say, it's like GM organic, so that you have GM crops that you do not have to add pesticide, herbicide, fertilizer. That's not always the ones that are currently available, and there's a whole reason for that as well. So that's why we don't trust politicians, in my view, one reason, and there's something that we could do about it, or at least politicians could. So together we can send a strong message, we can demand evidence. There are a lot of people around here, scientists, but also citizen demand. And why should citizens demand it? Well, you know, at the end of it, it takes a lot of effort to generate scientific evidence. You mostly pay for it, so we need to make best use of it. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Issues that's emerged over time, particularly because there's so much interest in science as this great enlightening tool again today, is actually you look back at the age of the Enlightenment, and indeed you look at the Victorian age, how much the new science either coexisted with terrible ideas about the inferiority of other races, women, or was used to reinforce those ideas. And certainly I've been reading a lot of books recently about, you know, all those ideas around eugenics. People like Winston Churchill, you know, early 20th century, was fascinated by eugenics as somehow improving mankind. That's one of the issues that keeps coming up about why so many people have an instinctive distrust of scientists. It's about this fear that actually scientists might be carrying certain kinds of perhaps social biases that they don't acknowledge. And certainly historically, right through to Auschwitz, that link is a strong one, isn't it?
No, I agree, and that's why I was at pains to say, because I think many scientists that I've come across have, you know, said to me, oh, but we scientists are somehow superhuman, and we don't have a value base on which we do our science. And I've generally found that not to be true, that we do all, even what topics we choose, you know, when you're at university and you're thinking of what specialism or whatever, the things that we often choose reflect our own philosophy about what's important in life and so on. So you're right, in terms of trust, I mean, there is a high level of trust in scientists, and I think that what we need to do is, and other scientists are very good at this, is challenge where someone is misusing science. And actually for me, one of the best examples of this is something that, it's creationism. It's looking at the teaching of creationism. It's quite interesting because it's almost done in, it's like a pseudoscience. It's to try and give it some credibility and so on. And of course that makes it quite dangerous in a way because of the trust that people have in science.
One of the sort of scientific issues which I've been amazed at how it's become such a big contention is issues around nutrition, and the whole fat is no longer bad and sugar is bad. And I've been amazed at how recently a lot of the things we were being told are being torn up, and people like my mother are going, I told you butter was fine all along. What's your view on that? Because there's so much scientific writing, people like Robert Lustig, you know, with his book on sugar, for example.
Yeah. It's a particularly interesting area, and what's interesting about it is it's a really good example of people being selective in the use of evidence. I'm not saying you're being selective, but if somebody, you know, it's like we all know someone who lived till there was 100 and he was a smoker.
Yeah.
So smoking, you can, you know, it's good for you, and he drank half a bottle of whiskey a day as well. So, you know, what scientists say is nonsense. And I suspect almost every single person in this room knows the basis of a healthy, balanced diet. We don't always do it, of course, because of lifestyle and so on. What's very helpful is to get nutritional advice. The advice around fat, I think, is quite interesting, and I think we have got a lot of that wrong. I mean, fat is absolutely essential. There's a lot of fat in our body. Every little cell that I break up for my own enjoyment and my research is just a ball of fat, you know, with stuff inside it. We need that fat, but it's how much we have of it and what sort of fat it is.
But also those scientific diagrams, we were talking, you know, the pyramids that the FDA had in the USA, and you know how much red meat you were supposed to eat. Certainly it's changed since the 50s, but how carbohydrates were the basis of a healthy diet. That's all being, I mean, I think people are genuinely confused in a whole new way now. And the whole use of low sugar and low fat foods promoted as part of a healthy diet, which there's a lot of claims now that particularly low sugar, things that taste of sugar, might send your body, you know, with the wrong messages. I mean, it's incredible that we're so confused.
It is incredible, and I suppose what all of that advice probably was implemented for was looking at how to provide good nutrition for growing populations, and particularly with processed food industry and so on. And then, you know, as people started exercising less, using fewer calories, became more overweight, then there was the big diet industry, and that triggered a lot of this low fat, low sugar and so on. And it's distorted a lot of the thing. I'm not saying scientists are not, are they to blame?
Well, I suppose what you've raised there is the issue of corporate sponsorship of scientific research, which is a huge concern, isn't it, of the papers that get promoted. And often there's a story about, well, hang on, whose agenda might this serve?
Mm-hmm. No, I agree, but there's a question to be answered here. In the European Union, there are a set of legislations and an organisation that looks at the safety of chemicals. And how they do this is that companies that want to have a chemical used produce the data and then give it to the organisation for them to have a look at. And I fundamentally think that is not the best way to do it. What I think is that they should provide the chemical to the organisation, who should have the wherewithal to be able to do the testing. But it would cost us a lot of money.
Taxpayers' money.
Yeah, taxpayers' money. Now, I still think there are other ways around that, so that we could say that we'll test it for you, but it'll cost this amount of money. And so you have to give us that money to get your license effectively. So there are ways that we could do it. And I think that we have to move down that direction, because it maybe didn't come out so much in that kind of hall of fame with who trusts whom. But we don't trust companies. So we don't trust company data, and we feel that they have vested interests. And actually, I can't help but agree with that in many ways. I had a wonderful discussion. I won't mention names, but it was a discussion whilst I was in Brussels on harm reduction. So it was looking at some things like, you know, many people are addicted to tobacco products. Can we eradicate tobacco products? No, or alcohol. So how do you reduce the harm? And you might know that, again in Scotland, there was a proposal to have a minimum price per unit of alcohol to try, because all the evidence tells us that doesn't affect a kind of social drinker like me, because I'm paying above that unit price anyway. But it does affect the people who are buying the super lager and so on, and it reduces consumption. So it is good, but who opposed that? The drinks industry. And they were busy telling me that we don't need this because it does not reduce consumption. So I said, well, that's interesting. So there wouldn't be any reduction in sales then if you introduced that? No, no. And then he said, obviously the problem is they know it will reduce consumption.
So
it's
exactly
not good for business.
what tobacco companies say whenever there were attempts to shut down advertising. Like, but advertising doesn't sell cigarettes, so you don't need to change it. There was something you raised early on when you talked about how the Europe, and I presume meant specifically the European Union, is number one in terms of the kind of impact of science and technology. I have to ask, what do you think would be the impact of a no vote for Britain?
Well, I think my colours are nailed to the
Okay.
mast.
But what would be the impact if we did leave?
Would we survive? Would we still have science in the UK? Yes. Would we be globally competitive? No, we wouldn't be. We rely very much on being able to attract the best in Europe to come and work in the UK. Also, our scientists go elsewhere and make partnerships and collaborations across Europe. And one of the biggest funding schemes, Horizon 2020, which provides almost 80 billion euros over a 7-year period, we get out of that here in the UK much more than we put in. So for us scientists in the UK, it's like having an extra research council that is funding the translation of the brilliant ideas we have into knowledge which leads to impact. And if you believe, like me, that science, engineering and technology are the basis of our sustainable economy in the UK, we cannot compete with others on the basis of being cheaper, because someone will always undercut us. But my goodness, we're smart. And if we don't develop that, we'll have real problems.
Have a brain drain, you think?
I think
and
we
lose
would
funding.
have, what we wouldn't have is we wouldn't have this huge influx of smart people to us. We could not go elsewhere. We couldn't provide the infrastructure and so on that we need.
I'd like to ask a question about gender and evidence, but just before I do that, can I make a point in semi-defense of politicians? I'm not a politician, I know it's a bit
Briefly.
But surely what you were reporting was the fact of what people believe about politicians, and isn't it the scientists or the social scientists' job actually to say how robust are those perceptions about the trustworthiness of that list? So it may well be that people don't understand anything that judges do, but they think they've got high status, whereas they do think they understand what politicians do.
Okay, thank you.
My question about gender and evidence is, do you think that as more women come into science, that will change the approach to gathering evidence and the way that evidence is used?
Thank you.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, because if you look at how people operate in science and in research, there are some gender differences. And thinking back to Rosalind Franklin and this idea that she thought she had to, dot every I and cross every T before she was prepared to get things out of the laboratory. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that, and this is a generalization because there's a lot of diversity amongst women and amongst men, but that women tend to want to do that, to be absolutely certain before then putting something forward, whereas often their male colleagues in the same laboratory environment tend to think, okay, I think we've got it more or less right. Let's send it off to the reviewers. They'll tell us if we need to do something. Now that's rather a generalization. But including more women, will it hugely differ? Will it make a big difference? In my experience, but this is not the broad body of evidence, having mixed groups in laboratories makes them much more imaginative and inventive. So what I would expect to see is greater challenge of thinking in where you have mixed groups. I don't like groups which are all women or all men in laboratories, and I've had both in my scientific career, and I didn't like how the lab worked with either of them, but mixed was good. But I mean, there must be some social science on this. I'm not aware.
If only we had Tim Hunt in the room to continue this conversation. But I thought you were going to say that it'll make a difference when you have more seniority of women, because surely part of the argument about why people like Rosalind Franklin and even today might be more cautious is because of the reaction they're going to get from their male superiors if they get it wrong, which they might feel would be different than if a man did it.
Yeah. Actually, just to be fair on Tim Hunt was an excellent scientist when I was doing my PhD, and he helped me enormously. He had no need to. And I didn't fall in love with him, and he didn't fall in love with me. So, and he tells really bad jokes, and I think
we will agree on that. Yeah.
That really backfired on him. But he is a great scientist, and he was always supportive of women, in my experience. But having said that about the seniority of women, there is an interesting thing, and again, I'm sort of reluctant to say it because it's good to have the numbers and the evidence, but in my experience, and I've done a lot of mentoring of both men and women in my life, and have been mentored myself by both men and women, and what I found consistently, and it really was pretty consistent, is that the women were always reluctant to put themselves forward, whereas a man at the same stage would think about going for, the professorship at Oxford or something, and the woman who
but isn't that social conditioning?
It is.
Like that thing you showed us from 1955.
Women are thinking, I should wait to be asked. If somebody really wants me, I should wait to be asked. I have a theory, and this is a really bad one, and I think it's partly because men are used to rejection, because when they're young, and a male colleague explained this to me. When you're a young guy, 17 or 18, and you want to go out with a girl, if you ask 9 and they all say no, but the 10th one says yes, that's a success. That's good, because you've got a woman going out with you. And women aren't in a position from very early years of ever doing that. We don't ask. And so we don't like rejection. I think that's that. I could describe myself there. I don't like putting myself in a position that I would be rejected. Whereas, and that's just, I just fabricated that. But
it's a hunch, I think. It's a hunch. Okay, let's take a couple
honest.
more. I'm going to take the lady there in the fourth row in the black, and the other lady in the second row on this side next. Second row from the back. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I'm more of the social science side, so I will address that if you don't mind. I work for an organisation that influences policy, so I'm quite interested in.
Can we keep it really tight? Sorry, just because of time.
Sorry. Okay.
Thanks.
So I'm wondering about when politicians or policy makers say they're going to do something, that they're also selling a result. And I'm wondering about how we as a public build accountability mechanisms that not only allow for evidence and uncertainty, but encourage its communication. And does that mean as a public, we not only need to demand transparency, but also be more flexible or forgiving when results don't appear?
Okay.
Yeah, I think we should demand transparency. So, for example, if we just take the GM example, if politicians don't use the evidence, I think we as citizens should hold them accountable and say, why didn't you use the evidence? Because we've paid a lot of money to generate that, and now you're just ignoring it, so tell us why. And there can be lots of good reasons why you would do that. So I think that if we had some mechanism to have policy, and then for us very easily to be able to look at the evidence in a way that was also clear. So, because I've looked at a lot of this, and I am a scientist, and I can't understand half of it, when I'm reading it. So I think that there's deliberate obfuscation of the evidence sometimes, which is not helpful. And I think that we should oblige our political class to do this. But I think the very beginning of the transparency part is absolutely key. Without transparency, you don't get trust. And without trust, it puts up a barrier to so many things, innovation being the most important, is that we don't use the knowledge. We could be outstanding in terms of innovation, but there is a barrier to it because we don't trust how it's being translated and how it will be used.
I would say also responsible reporting is part of it, which is why people have to complain when they see irresponsible reporting. And the programme I present, Newswatch, we get lots of really good spots about irresponsible use of data, which is really good. And that's how you challenge it, and that's how you change perceptions. Right, you've got the mic there.
Thank you. Moving on from what you just spoke about, policy and the misinterpretation of evidence or obfuscation of it, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how the government at the moment have been interpreting evidence about deaths on the weekends and how this is going to affect the NHS in the future.
Okay.
I think most of the evidence around that is highly controversial, if I'm honest. And I think if you look at issues such as where we have acute need of healthcare services, your acute need is served very well at the weekends as the same as during the week. I think there's a kind of a distortion of evidence going on around that. I should also be honest and say I haven't unpicked that completely, and part of the reason is because I am living in Scotland. We are not faced with the same issues.
Different.
But I mean, I've been speaking to my medical colleagues down here about it, and I think that there is a big concern.
Thank you. Right, let's take a couple more if we can. Take the gentleman here, and I'll take the gentleman down the front next. Whichever gets the microphone first starts talking first. Yep, go ahead.
I'm thinking about your interaction with policymakers and decision makers at government and government level. Do you think you've been less like the Babelfish and more like Cassandra? And if so, what would be the most dangerous black swans where your advice has been ignored?
Overall, I would say the experience has been very positive. And it makes me realise that when we educate scientists and as part of our careers, we should somehow have much more involvement with policymakers and politicians to understand how we might best translate in order that we can have the impact with our knowledge that we would really want to see. So I mean, I would hope I was working more on the side of the Babelfish rather than Cassandra, because the thing about, as a scientist, I never see a problem. I only see a challenge. And I think that should be useful for politicians because they only see problems. So in a way, having scientists there saying, yeah, look, there are options, there are different things that we can do, is actually a very positive thing. There are always going to be black swans. But if you have, and actually it's very interesting you mentioned that, Nicholas Taleb, who wrote the book, is vitriolically against GM and quite rude about it, but without using any of the evidence, which is a bit perplexing. But one of the, I remember Alex Salmond talking to me about the black swan of oil being discovered in the North Sea off the coast of Scotland. Now that was an unexpected event, and he was saying, he was trying to say that economists were scientists. Sorry if there's economists in the room, but I used to have an argument with him about whether economics was a real science or not, because he's an economist. And he said, you know, scientists didn't know that there was oil in the North Sea. Well, actually, scientists did find the oil in the North Sea, and what scientists and engineers were able to do is take advantage of it once we found it. So in a way, it doesn't matter if a black swan happens. We sort of have the way to deal with it.
Okay, Anne, take this question.
A few years ago, Professor Nutt, who was in charge of advising the government on drug policy, was removed or demoted or something because basically what he was saying was off message as far as the government is concerned. And I think that's quite a systemic problem, that there's an increasing tendency to want to try and shut some scientists up if they're not saying what policy is.
Yeah.
Particularly where the policy is largely populist driven. I wonder if you could address that.
Yeah, so it's an interesting area. You're right, because actually he used a very interesting means of communication to talk about the relative harm of taking ecstasy compared to, say, I think it was ecstasy, compared to something like horse riding.
Yep.
So, and you know, what he was saying is it's much more dangerous going horse riding. And that is what the data suggests. But to be fair to the government at the time, you need to just drill down a little bit into what he said, because when you go horse riding, you wear a hard hat and you take precautions and you know what you're doing, and you probably have training and so on. If you take ecstasy, if you're in a club and somebody gives you a tablet, you don't know what it is, you don't know how pure it is, you don't know what your body reaction going to be. So you're not really comparing apples with apples. If I may say, I don't know him and I didn't know the government minister at the time, but there's also a thing to do with personal dynamics. Sometimes people just don't get on with each other.
Such an interesting answer. Such an interesting answer. Thank you so much. I really wish we had time for more questions, but we don't. I'm so sorry. So there's a couple of things before I finish. I wanted just, well, first I want to thank Dame Anne Glover, who I just thought gave an amazing lecture. And just a couple of other things. One is, obviously, this whole event is organised by the British Humanist Association. If you aren't a member, you can join or find out more about it. Humanism.org.uk.